everyone! Welcome back to our Ranger Roundup videos. So today's going to be a little different. We're not going to actually be talking to you. We actually have a professor at Eckerd College, Scott Dobrin, here to talk to you about beekeeping. If you would like to introduce yourself and just give us a little background about you, that'd be awesome.
Sure. So like you said, my name is Scott Dobrin. I'm a professor at Eckerd College. I joined Eckerd College just a couple of years ago. I grew up in South Florida on the East Coast, but got my PhD in North Carolina, and then was working in Maine for a couple of years, where I started working on both honeybees and bumblebees. My research interest and my passion really is in neuroscience, and so I study bees in the same way that a cancer researcher might study rats or fruit flies. I'm interested in studying their brain because they offer an interesting model. So we can talk more about that in general, but what's happened is as I've learned more about bees, I just found out they're really cool. So I've been studying bees both because they're interesting models, and just as I get more into them, I just study all the really neat, interesting things about them because bees are cool, and frankly, beekeepers are really interesting people.
Bees are very important to us and our ecosystem. So what do you think is the greatest role they serve to our environment?
So it's a really interesting question because they serve a lot of different roles. The easy one is a food source. You know, it's estimated that about a third of the food that you see in the grocery store is dependent on honeybees in particular, but other bee pollinators and just other pollination in general. But bees are really critical to our food source. But your question was about the environment, and I think that's one of the things that we don't think about a lot is how important bees, and not just honeybees, but all bees, there's about 3,000 different bees population in the United States and like 33,000 across the world. There's huge amounts of different kinds of bees, and most of them, if not all of them, are involved in pollination. So this idea of bringing pollen between the flowers, as you were both talking about in that first video, that is doing more than just providing food. That's allowing the plant to survive, to make new seeds, to pollinate one another, and to continue on. And without the bees doing that, we wouldn't have all the beautiful flower gardens that we have. Walking down, going to the Florida Botanical Gardens and seeing all of the majesty that they have, that's pollination that's there. And so without the bees, we also don't have that aspect. They do a lot more for us than just simply provide food.
So our next question is, what do beekeepers do and why are they important?
That's a great question. So what do beekeepers do? Beekeeping is a really interesting phrase because we don't really keep the bees, right? We provide a suitable home for the bees, one of these boxes. So if you've driven down in an agricultural area, you've probably seen, a white box that has a couple of things stacked high. Maybe there's 3 or 4 of them, and the bees are just coming and going freely. And so those boxes contain individual frames, typically, that allow the beekeepers to work through the colonies. But what's important to remember is that the doors are always open, that when the beekeeper goes through the colony, it's not like they put a net or a cage over the colony, the bees could fly away. What a beekeeper's role is sort of to be a caretaker for the bees. They are managing the colony, and they are making life easier for the bees. If you are keeping the bees the way the word really suggests and not allowing them to leave that colony, they're going to starve. And so it's a symbiotic relationship. It's this idea of we help the bees and the bees are helping us. And so what a beekeeper's role is to identify what's going on. What a beekeeper's trying to do is allow that colony of bees to survive, be healthy and strong for as long as possible. And so one of the things that beekeepers have to do is they have to get experience. And one of the really cool things about beekeeping, and I've done beekeeping in 3 different states, and everywhere I go, there has always been a vibrant beekeeping community made up of local beekeepers that are just there to help new beekeepers learn and to communicate information back and forth, because experience is so important in beekeeping. If you're interested in becoming a beekeeper, the first thing you should do is go to one of these meetings. It seems like it would be the last thing you'd want to do. You'd want to get bees and you want to go through this. Go to one of these meetings, you find somebody, and I guarantee you that within talking to a couple people, they will invite you out, they'll show you their bees, and they'll show you through the ropes of doing things, because that's the most important thing, is to get somebody who you can talk to about this.
So I know you touched on this earlier. You're not necessarily a beekeeper who's collecting honey, but you're kind of a beekeeper who's also a scientist. So what is your area of study? And I guess we can't call it a beekeeper anymore. We have to call it like a bee protector or something.
You need a new name. I'm going to think of something. Yeah, we need a new name. So I do get honey. You can't keep bees without being interested in some honey, of course. It's just too delicious. But it's not my main priority. So like I'd mentioned earlier, I'm a neuroscientist by training. I study how the brain changes with different experiences. And so I'm interested in how you and I, the 3 of us, are having this conversation right now. And because we're having a shared experience, our brains are going to change slightly, ever so slightly. I mean, it's not the most impactful thing in the world for you, but you'll have some memory of this. And because the 3 of us are having this shared experience, our brains are going to look a little bit more similar than they did before this shared experience. And so I'm interested in, how does experience change the structure of the cells in our brain? And now why I'm interested in honeybees in particular is because they provide me a natural model to study this. A model is some kind of it can be an animal, but it might also be a computer simulation, or it could be a petri dish in a laboratory, a petri dish of cells, but something that represents whatever it is you're actually studying. The honeybees allow for an opportunity for me to look at the brain of an organism, but to do it in a way that is as natural as possible. What people have been doing, and people have been studying this idea of experience-dependent changes in the brain for decades. People have been studying this in, for example, rodents, where they take a rodent and they put it on a running wheel and they allow it to exercise more. And when they do that, they can find parts of the brain that are known to be related to exercise start to grow and get bigger. What we don't know is why. We don't know if it's growing because they're becoming, that experience is so amazing that there's something positive about that experience, or if it's because the animal was put into a cage and that cage environment is so isolating and deprived that when they get access to the running wheel, it's really just getting them back to where they should have been to begin with. And so with the honeybee, going back to this idea of, I'm not keeping the bees, I'm providing a home to the bee, and then I allow her to go and fly around in her world and do her thing on her own. So what my job is to, and my students, is we will observe the colony. What a honeybee does, what lots of bees do, is that an individual bee will actually change her behaviors that she demonstrates, that she starts to do depending on her age. So that early in her life, she'll be primarily working inside of the colony. We call that nursing. And then later in her life, around 2-3 weeks old, she'll start to become a forager. Well, she'll start to go out of the colony, going to between pollen and nectar and collecting things like that. This is a very different life experience. Why I study the bees is because that transition between nursing and foraging has been shown by people before I came into this field, has been shown to change the structure of a very specific region of the brain. And so what I study is how are those changes occurring on a molecular scale? Because the idea is, and this is true for a lot of the medical breakthroughs that we have, is that there's a lot of similarity between the function of a bee brain and the function of a human brain. It's why we can study things like cancer and other medical disorders in things like fruit flies and rats, and then we can move those medications up to humans because of those similarities.
So our next question is a little bit different than the last one.
Sure.
So we wanted to ask, we hear about a lot of the bee populations diminishing. What are the major threats causing this decline practically to native bee populations right now?
When we say the bee populations, you rightfully pointed out that we're kind of mixing things up a little bit. We have this idea of bees referring to honeybees, we often talk about, and then sometimes people get a little bit more clear and they say honeybees and bumblebees. There's really one species of honeybee. There's a couple of floating around. There's some different types of honeybees. When you get to bumblebees, there's a variety of different species of bumblebees out there, in the tens to maybe 100 different kinds of bumblebees. But there's thousands and thousands of different bees, different native bees out there. And so when we're talking about honeybees, we're talking about agricultural problems. And when we're talking about native bees, we're talking about environmental problems. So these are two very real issues. And they're almost two distinct issues with one another, because one, it's the humans trying to manage the honeybees, and the others, it's really the native bees should be living on their own. But the things that we're doing to them are not allowing them to flourish as they once were. Climate change is definitely a factor that as we change the average temperature, you are going to change really subtle synchronizations. In Florida, coming to beekeep in Florida was weird for me, because in Florida, we don't really have a winter. And one of the things that honeybees do, the reason why honeybees are called honeybees, is they make large amounts of honey, excess amounts of honey, to help them to survive during the wintertime. One of the things that is critical is that when the bees finish that winter season and they emerge, that's not entirely based on temperature, but largely dependent on temperature. When they come out of, when they leave their colony in the springtime, they need to have flowers bloomed and ready for them to get more food. If we change the temperature and we change the time of year in which the bees emerge relative to the time of year in which the flowers start to come out, and they start to lose that synchronization, we might have the flowers start to bloom and not have bees around, and then we might have bees around and not have flowers for them to eat. So both sets, the flowers, like we started talking with, are dependent on the bees to pollinate them, and the bees need those flowers for their food. So it really hurts both of them. That is definitely an issue. We have other factors of just simply as it's getting warmer, it's harder for the bees to survive. It takes more energy to cool the colony down. There are things like the chemicals in the environment. So agricultural pesticides, people's lawn care pesticides, chemicals that are just, drugs, the prescription medications that are dumped down people's toilets and thrown out and are just found in the environment. All of these things are, affecting, frankly, are affecting humans, but are affecting bees as well. One of the main ways that pesticides are approved is just looking at whether or not they kill the bee, or at the amount in which they kill a bee. you might not need to kill the bee if you just hurt it enough that it can't do its job. So if the bee is not dead, but she can't forage well, the colony is going to die. And so there are pesticides out there that certainly will influence the survival of a bee, but there are other ones that don't impact their survival, but do seem to change the ability for the bee to make a new memory or the bees to learn. What's likely going on is that any one of these issues is not the main problem, but it is likely a combination of all of these things. That climate change combined with the chemical use, combined with the fact that we're just encroaching on native natural environments, makes it more difficult for them to find places to survive. And then one of the things that I really appreciated you touching on is this idea of the changing landscape of the average farm. Nowadays, with industrial farming, there is more and more, so certainly not the only way they do it, but there is more and more prevalence. It's more likely to see just acres of a single crop and nothing else. Well, what plants do is they might pollinate for 3 weeks and then just stop. So for 3 weeks out of the year, any native bee, not the bees that we bring in and then we leave, the honeybees, but the ones that are just naturally living in that environment, they have 3 weeks worth of food and then they're out of luck. They don't have any more food left. And so by not providing the filler crops, the crops that we originally were using to help the crops, what they're actually doing is they're helping the native bees there. And so having small patches in a person's yard, I have kids. I want my kids to run around, and so I like to have a mowed grass as well, but I also like to have areas in my garden that the bees can come and pollinate. And so trying to provide a mixture of environments that the humans can survive in, but also allow for bees and other pollinators to survive off of, I think is really critical for us.
What can we do as just normal people to positively impact the bee population? So maybe having an area in our yard. What else could we do?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there's a variety of things people can do. For the viewers of this video, I think talking to your parents is probably the most simple thing you can do, and just asking them what they know about bees. You can talk to your parents about the fact that, hey, that vegetable that tomato, the almonds, all of these foods that you're eating, appreciate the fact that the bees are a part of that. I think that's one of the biggest things. The next step is thinking about the environment that you have influence on. We have yards. So what kind of chemicals are you putting out in your yards? Not necessarily avoiding all chemicals, but thinking about which chemicals are better and which chemicals are worse, how much to be applying, when to be applying, little things like that. There are a variety of different resources that people can look up online that will give you different bee-friendly approaches to maintaining gardens. The next step is to actually start providing areas in your home that will can serve as pollinator sources. So they sell pollinator mixes, typically are these really pretty wildflowers. And so you create these pretty garden areas, you get butterflies, you get bees, you get lots of life supported by it, and you're just helping the natural area. Taking little steps, having small gardens, being aware, talking to people about it. I think those are the things that are the easiest to do. The next steps are talking to beekeepers, maybe thinking about becoming a beekeeper. Those are definitely becoming more and more popular steps. And looking at your local regulations really is the most important thing. So there are a lot of things that people can do, and it can range from just simply talking to really taking action and trying to make a larger change. So, but they all help. And I think that it's important just to kind of appreciate them and simply not try to kill them when you see them. That's the most important one. Don't try to swat at them.